The first time I overheard my daughter's husband call me a burden, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, and I knew in that moment that the future I'd imagined for my legacy was about to change. What he didn't know was that I had already begun to map out a plan that would turn his insult into an opportunity. In the days that followed, I quietly arranged meetings with my banker, my attorney, and a financial planner, and I started making decisions that would surprise my family and restore my sense of dignity. But before I take you through the twists and turns, let me ask you to do something for me. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from, because our stories may be thousands of miles apart. Yet the emotions and lessons we share are often the same. There will be open loops in my story, questions about a letter my late wife wrote to me, a clause in my will I hadn't told my daughter about, and the moment I decided to spend down my inheritance on causes and experiences that mattered to me. Keep listening, because these pieces will all come together in ways my son-in-law never anticipated. My name is Frank, and I'm a 71-year-old retired civil engineer living in San Antonio, Texas. The broad Texas sky has watched over me for decades as I built highways and bridges that carry people to their destinations, and now it watches as I navigate the bridge between my past and my future. I grew up in Corpus Christi, the son of a diesel mechanic and a school librarian. We didn't have much, but we had love, a backyard garden full of tomatoes and okra, and a father who taught me the value of hard work. On Saturdays, my dad would take me to the local hardware store, McCoy's Building Supply, and then to Whataburger for breakfast taquitos. We'd sit in the truck eating, and he'd talk about engines, responsibility, and how a man's handshake should mean something. Those moments shaped me. They instilled a belief that providing for your family and honoring your word were non-negotiable. I carried those lessons through college at Texas A&M University, where I studied engineering and met my future wife, Mary, in a calculus class. Mary was a nursing student from a small town near Waco. She had a laugh like bells and a resolve that could move mountains. We married during our senior year, exchanging simple gold bands at the county courthouse and celebrating with burritos from Taco Cabana because that's what we could afford. After graduation, we moved to San Antonio, where I took a job with the Texas Department of Transportation, and Mary joined the surgical unit at Methodist Hospital. We rented a tiny duplex near the River Walk, saved every extra dollar, and dreamed of owning a home where we could raise a family. When our daughter Sarah was born in 1984, our world expanded. Mary took maternity leave, and I rearranged my work schedule so I could be at home more. I built Sarah a cradle with my own hands using pine from Home Depot, and Mary painted the nursery a soft blue. We managed to buy a modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs in 1987, putting down 20% thanks to years of disciplined saving and a small inheritance Mary received when her grandmother passed. Our interest rate on the mortgage was high compared to today, but we fixed that by refinancing through our credit union when rates dropped. Over the years, I worked on dozens of projects, from widening Interstate 35 to reinforcing bridges across the Guadalupe River. My job required precision and patience, and I loved the tangible results, the way concrete cured under the Texas sun, the feel of rebar under my gloves, the sight of cars moving smoothly over a bridge I helped design. Mary and I raised Sarah with the same values our parents had taught us: honesty, hard work, and compassion. Sarah grew up watching her mother care for patients and her father draw up plans and pour concrete. She also watched us pinch pennies, clip coupons from the San Antonio Express News, and choose family picnics at Brackenridge Park over expensive vacations. We taught her to respect money without worshiping it. She earned an allowance by mowing the lawn and washing dishes, and when she turned 16, we helped her buy a used Toyota Corolla from a neighbor. We required her to pay for insurance and gas, which she did by working at a H-E-B grocery store after school. Sarah excelled academically and earned a scholarship to Texas State University, where she majored in marketing. We were proud of her independence, and even prouder when she graduated without student loans because we supplemented her tuition with savings from a mutual fund we'd started years earlier. After college, Sarah married a man named Tyler. He worked in commercial real estate and prided himself on being a savvy investor. He dressed well, drove a leased Lexus, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had yet to experience a significant setback. At first, we welcomed him warmly. He treated Sarah well, and they seemed happy. Mary and I hosted Sunday dinners where Tyler and I would talk about market trends over plates of brisket and sides from Rudy's BBQ. He had big plans to buy rental properties and build a portfolio that would carry them into early retirement. Mary was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 2015. She fought bravely for 3 years, enduring surgeries and chemotherapy while still finding time to volunteer at church and plant flowers in the front yard. On a crisp March morning in 2018, she took her last breath with Sarah and me at her bedside. After Mary's funeral, Sarah and Tyler offered to have me move into their home. I declined because I couldn't bear to leave the house Mary and I had filled with memories. The creak of the floorboards, the smell of her perfume in the closet, the way the afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window. I told them I was okay living alone, which was mostly true. I poured my grief into projects, refinishing our dining room table, joining a men's Bible study, volunteering at the San Antonio Food Bank, and tutoring math at a local middle school. Tyler called me regularly at first, checking on me and offering to help with home repairs. But over time, his tone shifted. He began asking questions about my finances, how much my pension paid, whether my life insurance beneficiary designations were up to date, and if I had considered adding him to my bank account so he could help manage things. I brushed off his inquiries by saying I had everything under control and that Sarah was my executor. I trusted Sarah, and I assumed Tyler's interest stemmed from a misplaced desire to protect me, but Mary's voice in my head urged caution. I should mention that Texas follows a one-party consent law for recordings, meaning only one party needs to consent to record a conversation. But I never entertained the idea of recording Tyler. Instead, I wrote down notes after each conversation, including dates, times, and the gist of what he said, and I stored those notes in a folder labeled Financial Discussions. In 2020, the pandemic hit, and I rarely saw Sarah and Tyler in person. We communicated via phone or FaceTime. I continued volunteering by packing meals for families in need and delivered food boxes to homebound seniors using my Ford F-150, ensuring I followed safety protocols. By mid-2021, Sarah told me that Tyler had lost some real estate deals and that their finances were tight. She hinted that they might need help paying their property taxes. I sent a small check with no strings attached because I loved my daughter and wanted to help her through a tough time. Tyler thanked me profusely and promised to repay me. A month later, he asked if I would co-sign a line of credit at a local bank so he could fund a can't-miss flip house. I said no, reminding him that I didn't co-sign loans because I had spent my life avoiding unnecessary debt. That's when his demeanor shifted. He made snide remarks about how older people should let go of control and let the next generation take over. He said, "You're sitting on all that money, and you're just going to hoard it until you die." The first time he called me a burden was at Sarah's birthday dinner. We were sitting around their table eating enchiladas, and he laughed while telling a story about a friend's father who had moved into a retirement community. He looked at me and said, "I'm glad my father-in-law isn't like that, a real burden, not enjoying life or helping his kids." The words stung, not just because they were cruel, but because I realized he saw me as a resource, not as a person. He didn't know that Mary and I had scrimped and saved to build a comfortable retirement and that we had earmarked most of our estate for Sarah and any grandchildren we might have. That night I went home, sat at the kitchen table Mary and I had varnished together, and opened a notebook. I wrote down what Tyler had said, and then I wrote a question to myself. What do you owe to those who see you as a burden? As I sat there, my mind went to a letter Mary had written to me years earlier when she was first diagnosed. She had sealed it and told me not to open it unless our daughter started treating me poorly. I had tucked it into our safe deposit box at our credit union, along with our wills and a small envelope of family heirloom jewelry. I decided it was time to read Mary's letter. The next morning I drove to the credit union, showed my ID to the teller, and waited as she retrieved my box from the vault. She reminded me that because it was a busy day, I might have to wait for a private booth. I nodded, took the box into a small room, and opened it. Among the documents and keepsakes, I found Mary's letter sealed in a blue envelope. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Mary's handwriting was steady and familiar. She wrote about how much she loved me, how proud she was of Sarah, and how she feared that Tyler might not have our daughter's best interests at heart. She encouraged me to live my life fully and to use my resources to create joy for myself and others if ever I felt devalued or pressured. She wrote, "Spend it if you have to, Frank. Buy the truck you always wanted, travel to see the places we never made it to, donate to charity, but do not feel obligated to leave everything to someone who treats you as a burden." Reading her words filled me with a combination of sadness and resolve. Mary knew me better than anyone, and she understood that my inclination was to preserve and provide. She also recognized that generosity must be earned, not demanded. Armed with her blessing, I made my first appointment with a certified financial planner from Edward Jones. We sat in an office decorated with framed quotes about retirement, and she asked me about my goals, my assets, and my fears. I told her about the pension I received from the state, the 401k I had rolled into an IRA at Fidelity, the mutual funds we had built, and the life insurance policy Mary and I had purchased. I also told her about Tyler's comments and my concern that Sarah might be influenced by him. The planner listened carefully and suggested that I consider spending some of my assets on experiences and causes that brought me joy. She explained that it was common for older adults to feel guilty about using their money, but that money is a tool meant to enhance life. She also advised me to review the beneficiaries on my accounts and to consider creating a living trust that would distribute funds to Sarah under conditions promoting financial literacy and service. She emphasized that a trust can include clauses that require the beneficiary to complete courses in budgeting or to volunteer a certain number of hours before receiving distributions. Her suggestion resonated with me. I didn't want to punish Sarah, but I also wanted to ensure she was financially savvy and that she and Tyler couldn't squander what Mary and I had built. Next, I met with Ms. Nguyen, an estate attorney recommended by my pastor. She had gray hair pulled into a bun and spoke with authority. She reviewed my will and advised me to create a revocable living trust. She also suggested adding a no-contest clause, making it less appealing for Tyler to challenge the estate because he would risk losing his share if he contested. We drafted a trust stating that upon my death, my estate would fund a scholarship at Texas A&M University in Mary's name for students pursuing nursing. Another portion would endow a chair at our church to support community programs. A third portion would be placed in a trust for any grandchildren, requiring them to complete financial literacy courses and volunteer hours before accessing funds. We added language that allowed me to draw from the trust during my lifetime for my health, support, and happiness. We named Ms. Nguyen as the successor trustee, ensuring independence and professionalism. As for Sarah, I gave her a life estate in the house. She could live in it until her death, but she could not sell or borrow against it. This ensured she would always have a roof over her head without giving Tyler the opportunity to liquidate the property. After signing the trust, I felt a sense of relief. I had taken steps to secure Mary's wishes and to protect myself, but I wasn't done. I needed to honor Mary's instruction to live fully. I decided to finally take the road trip Mary and I had always dreamed about, driving up through the Texas Panhandle, across New Mexico, and into Colorado, visiting national parks and small towns along the way. I bought a gently used Airstream trailer from a dealership north of Austin and hitched it to my F-150. Before hitting the road, I deposited some cash into my checking account to cover expenses. The teller at Chase reminded me that large deposits could be subject to a hold. She explained that under federal law, banks must make the first $225 available the next business day and may hold the remainder for several days. I thanked her, smiled at the irony. Here I was learning about deposit holds like it was my first time, even though I had known this for decades and waited for the funds to clear before paying the trailer in full. I also changed the locks on my house, not because I intended to shut out Sarah, but because I wanted to ensure that Tyler couldn't enter without permission. I consulted a locksmith who reminded me that landlords in Texas cannot change locks to evict tenants without going through proper legal channels. Since Sarah wasn't a tenant and Tyler had no legal right to my home, I was within my rights to secure the house. With my affairs in order, I set off on my trip. My first stop was Palo Duro Canyon, often called the Grand Canyon of Texas. The canyon walls glowed ochre and gold in the late afternoon light, and I hiked a trail to Lighthouse Rock, my boots kicking up red dust as I walked. I camped overnight under a sky filled with stars, making coffee on a Coleman stove and feeling Mary's presence in the quiet. From there, I drove to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I visited the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum and walked around the plaza, listening to street musicians and browsing art galleries. I bought a hand-woven blanket at a market to keep in my Airstream, paying the vendor in cash and receiving a small discount. In Colorado, I parked my trailer near Durango and took the narrow-gauge railroad up to Silverton. The train wound along cliffs and through pine forests, the scent of wood smoke filling the air. I sat next to a retired teacher from Kansas City who told me about her own children and how she planned to donate her estate to a literacy program. These conversations with strangers reminded me that I wasn't alone in facing difficult family dynamics. Many older adults grapple with how to balance love and boundaries, generosity and self-respect. As I traveled, I kept a journal of my experiences. I wrote about the taste of green chili stew in Santa Fe, the way the wind whistled through the slot canyons in Utah, and the feeling of standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon, looking down into a vast abyss carved over millennia. I visited Zion National Park and hiked the Riverside Walk, listening to the Virgin River rush past. I stopped in Las Vegas long enough to see the lights and eat at a buffet at Caesar's Palace, where I noticed people my age playing slot machines and wondered how many of them were spending their kids' inheritance intentionally or out of desperation. My favorite stop was in Bryce Canyon, where hoodoos rose like spires from the earth. I sat on a bench at sunrise, the air crisp, my thermos of Folgers coffee steaming, and I thought about Mary's instruction to spend it if necessary. I realized that these moments of wonder were exactly what she meant by living fully. Back home between travels, I continued to invest in myself and my community. I signed up for a woodworking class at a local Rockler store, where I learned to carve intricate patterns on cutting boards and to build a shaker-style table. I purchased walnut and maple boards and spent hours sanding and finishing them until they gleamed. I also joined a senior fitness program at the YMCA, attending Silver Sneakers classes twice a week. We did light aerobics and resistance training, using resistance bands and small hand weights. The instructor reminded us to stay hydrated, and I always brought a reusable bottle from Walmart filled with lemon water. During one class, a man named Earl told me about the time his nephew tried to sell his house without telling him. Earl discovered the scam when a realtor called to ask about a showing. Earl reported it to the police, and the nephew was charged with fraud. Earl's story reinforced my decision to keep my property documents secure and to monitor my county recorder's office website for any unauthorized filings. Sarah occasionally called me during this period, sometimes asking how I was doing and other times hinting that Tyler thought I should move in with them for my own good. I told her about my travels and new hobbies and asked her if she'd like to join me on a weekend trip to the hill country. She said she was busy with work and Tyler's plans, but promised we'd go someday. One day, Tyler called me directly. He started by apologizing for his earlier comment about burdens, and then pivoted to asking if I would consider giving them an advance on their inheritance so they could invest in a multifamily property. He said it would secure their future and that I wouldn't want to see them struggle. I paused and thought about Mary's letter and the trust documents sitting in Ms. Nguyen's office. I told him I would discuss it with my financial planner and my attorney. He pressured me, saying that time was of the essence, that deals like this didn't come around often, and that he didn't want to involve lawyers because they slowed things down. His insistence reminded me of the warnings we give volunteers at the food bank. If someone urges you to act quickly with your money, it's usually in their interest, not yours. I repeated that I would consult my advisors and ended the call. I wrote down the details of that conversation in my notebook and then went to visit Ms. Nguyen. She reiterated that I should not make large gifts without considering tax implications and the impact on my retirement. She reminded me that Tyler's proposal could jeopardize the safeguards we had put in place to protect my assets. When Tyler called again a week later, I told him I would not provide an advance. He responded by saying I was selfish and that Sarah had been telling him I was becoming forgetful. He hinted that maybe she should take over my finances before I did something rash. I felt my pulse quicken, not from fear of forgetting, but from anger at his manipulation. I told him that I had a durable power of attorney and a trust in place, and that any attempt to challenge my competence would be met with evidence of my careful planning. Tyler hung up on me, and I sat in my chair shaking. I took a deep breath, brewed a cup of chamomile tea, and called Sarah. She apologized for Tyler's behavior, but defended his frustration, saying he just wanted to secure their future. We agreed to meet for lunch at a Chili's halfway between our houses. Over chicken fajitas, I explained my plans, the trust, the travel, the charitable giving. I told her about Mary's letter and how I felt when Tyler called me a burden. I said I loved her, but that I could not and would not finance her husband's schemes. Sarah listened quietly, tears pooling in her eyes. She admitted that Tyler had lost money on several flips and that they were overwhelmed by debt. She said she understood my decision, but wished I would consider helping them with some expenses. I told her I would pay for my own funeral in advance to relieve her of that burden, but that any further assistance would come with conditions. Namely, that she complete a financial literacy course and attend debt counseling sessions through a nonprofit like Consumer Credit Counseling Service. She agreed begrudgingly, and I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. I knew I couldn't fix her marriage or her finances, but I could set boundaries and offer guidance. Over the next year, I continued to use my resources in ways that enriched my life and honored Mary. I bought a season ticket package to the San Antonio Spurs and invited friends from church to join me. I became a regular at the Pearl Farmers Market, where I bought fresh bread, honey, and local cheeses. I took cooking classes at the Central Market and learned how to make paella and homemade pasta. I also donated to organizations that meant something to me. I funded a scholarship at my old high school for students pursuing engineering. I gave money to the church's youth program so they could renovate their meeting space. I volunteered with Habitat for Humanity, swinging a hammer alongside younger volunteers and sharing stories about building bridges. At the same time, I kept my financial house in order. I reviewed my budget monthly, tracked my expenses using a simple spreadsheet on my laptop, and set up alerts on my Bank of America accounts to notify me of withdrawals over $300. I also talked with my neighbor, who was a retired accountant, about the current court backlog. He told me that the probate courts in Bexar County were still experiencing delays from pandemic shutdowns and staff shortages. Contested cases could take many months to be heard, which reinforced the wisdom of my living trust and no contest clause. In January 2023, I received a letter from Sarah. She told me that she and Tyler were divorcing. She said she had signed up for the financial literacy course I suggested and that she had taken a part-time job at Target to help pay off their debt. She wrote that she understood why I was spending my inheritance and asked if she could join me on my next trip. Her letter broke open the door I thought might remain closed. I replied, inviting her to join me on a road trip to Big Bend National Park in the spring. We set a date and started planning. While we planned our trip, I continued my usual routines. I met with my Silver Sneakers group, volunteered at the food bank, and took a pottery class at a local studio. I built birdhouses with a group of kids from the church and installed them in the community garden near our neighborhood. The trip to Big Bend with Sarah was healing. We drove west through the West Texas plains, passing wind turbines and cattle ranches, listening to a playlist of Willie Nelson and George Strait. We camped in the Chisos Mountains, hiked the Window Trail, and sat at sunset watching the sky turn from orange to purple. In those quiet moments, Sarah and I talked honestly. She told me about the emotional abuse she had endured and her fear of starting over. I told her about my grief, my anger, and the freedom I felt spending my money on experiences instead of hoarding it for someone who didn't value me. We returned from Big Bend closer and more understanding of each other. She thanked me for the trip, and I thanked her for meeting me halfway, literally and figuratively. As months passed, Sarah finished her financial course and took over as manager of a local boutique. She paid off high-interest credit cards, built an emergency fund, and started investing a small amount each month. She called me to share her progress and ask for advice about mutual funds versus index funds, and I referred her to my financial planner. Meanwhile, I continued my philanthropic spending. I donated to the San Antonio Symphony after reading about their financial struggles. I sponsored 2 water wells through a charity called Living Water International, knowing that people in developing countries would have access to clean water. I joined a monthly giving program at Meals on Wheels to ensure more seniors received hot meals. Each donation felt like a way of transforming my wealth into something good. It reminded me that money has more impact when it flows rather than when it sits. I also invested in my health. I underwent a full physical at my doctor's office, scheduled a colonoscopy, and updated my eyeglasses prescription. I started taking an omega-3 supplement and made sure to walk at least 3 miles a day, often around the loop at McAllister Park. During one walk, I met an older couple who recognized me from the food bank. They told me about their own daughter who had married a man who convinced her to sign over her condo. The couple sued and eventually got the property back, but the legal battle took 2 years due to court backlogs. Hearing their story reinforced my belief in proactive planning and boundaries. I also encountered stories of seniors who had been pressured into changing their wills. A woman at my church told me that her son had downloaded a will template from the internet, filled in his name, and asked her to sign it without reading it. She declined and consulted an attorney, avoiding a potential disaster. These stories reminded me of the importance of legal counsel. While it might cost money up front, it saves heartache and financial loss later. As the year rolled forward, I continued to reflect on my choice to spend my inheritance. Occasionally, I questioned whether Mary would approve of how I allocated funds. Then I would pull out her letter, read her words again, and feel reassured. One day, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, I discovered a stack of savings bonds my parents had given me when I was a child. I had forgotten about them, and some were close to maturity. I took them to the bank to redeem them, and the teller told me they were worth more than I expected. I deposited the money into my travel fund, further enabling my adventures. I also found a hymn book in which Mary had scribbled notes from a church service. The pages were yellowed and fragile, and I didn't want them to deteriorate further. I visited a copy shop to have the pages scanned and bound. The associate carefully digitized her handwriting and returned both the original and a bound copy, allowing me to preserve her words without worrying about losing them. Seeing her handwriting again brought tears to my eyes. I sat at the dining table, the same table where Tyler had once called me a burden, and I smiled. I knew Mary would be proud of how I had stood up for myself and used our resources to bring joy and security to others. During the summer, I hosted a barbecue for friends from church and the neighborhood, I smoked brisket on a Traeger grill and served sides like coleslaw and peach cobbler. We sat at picnic tables under strings of lights, laughing and sharing stories. I looked around at the community I had cultivated and felt immense gratitude. One guest, a young man named Javier, approached me during the party. He said his mother had told him about my work at the food bank and that he wanted to volunteer. I connected him with a coordinator, and he became a regular volunteer. His enthusiasm reminded me that generosity begets generosity. As my circle expanded, so did my perspective. I began attending city council meetings to stay informed about local issues. I joined a group advocating for better public transportation and affordable housing. I wrote letters to the editor about elder financial abuse and the importance of living trusts. I felt engaged in my community and aware of how my voice could make a difference. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to heal. She joined a support group for divorced women, went to therapy, and reconnected with old friends. She visited me more often, sometimes bringing homemade muffins or a bouquet of wildflowers. We cooked together, watched old movies on TCM, and reminisced about Mary. At Thanksgiving, Sarah and I prepared a meal together at my house. We roasted a turkey, mashed potatoes, and baked rolls. We set the table with Mary's china. Tyler was not there, and the silence of his absence felt like peace rather than a void. Before we ate, we held hands and said what we were thankful for. I said, "I'm grateful for second chances, for open roads, and for a daughter who understands boundaries." In December, I took a trip to New York City to see the holiday lights and catch a Broadway show. I stayed at a small hotel near Times Square, rode the subway to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and visited the 9/11 Memorial. I thought about how Mary had always wanted to see a show, and so I bought a ticket to Hamilton and sang along under my breath, knowing she would have loved the music. Back in Texas, I continued to meet with my financial planner once a year. She remarked that my spending had brought me happiness without jeopardizing my long-term security. She reminded me to keep an eye on required minimum distributions from my IRA and to consider charitable distributions to reduce taxable income. I followed her advice, arranging for some of my distributions to go directly to the church and to the scholarship fund. I also kept an eye on my bank statements. Once I noticed a small, unauthorized debit for $8.99 from a subscription service I didn't recognize. I called the bank immediately, and they told me a scammer had likely tested my account with a small charge. They refunded the amount, issued a new debit card, and suggested I monitor my account even more closely. This incident reminded me that vigilance is an ongoing effort. In the spring, I decided to visit Washington, D.C. to tour the Smithsonian Museums and the National Archives. I booked a flight through Southwest Airlines and arranged to stay with my cousin, who lived in Arlington. During my visit, I saw the Constitution, walked along the National Mall, and visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, running my fingers over the names etched into the black granite. Standing in front of those names, I felt a deep sense of respect and sorrow. I thought about my high school classmate, Miguel, who had been drafted and never returned. I realized that life is a gift, and using my resources to honor that gift was not selfish but wise. While in D.C., I met with a friend who worked at AARP. We talked about elder financial abuse, and she encouraged me to share my story at a future conference. I agreed, seeing it as another opportunity to turn my personal experience into a public good. At the conference later that year, I stood behind a podium, looked out at the audience of seniors, social workers, and policymakers, and recounted how my daughter's husband called me a burden, and how that insult led me to re-examine my priorities. I explained the steps I took: reading Mary's letter, meeting with professionals, creating a living trust, spending on experiences, and setting conditions for inheritance. I emphasize that spending your money doesn't mean waste. It means investing in yourself, your community, and causes that reflect your values. I finished by urging attendees to take control of their narratives and to never let guilt or manipulation dictate their decisions. The audience applauded. After the session, people lined up to shake my hand and share their own stories. One woman said she'd been shamed by her daughter for buying a new car. Another man admitted he had been living frugally out of fear and would now take a vacation to see his grandchildren. These interactions affirmed that my decision to speak out mattered. It encouraged me to keep writing and speaking. At home, I kept a file on my computer titled Letters for the Future. In it, I drafted messages to be delivered after I'm gone. One explained why I spent as I did, another expressed my hopes for Sarah and any grandchildren, and a third outlined the details of the trust. I saved the file on a USB drive and placed it in my safe deposit box. I also made time for leisure. I joined a book club at the local library and read novels I had always meant to read. The Grapes of Wrath, Beloved, and Lonesome Dove. Discussing these books with people of various ages broadened my understanding of history and humanity. During the summer, I tried kayaking on the Guadalupe River. I rented a kayak from a shop in Gruane, donned a life vest, and paddled downstream, feeling the current pull me gently. I passed cypress trees with roots like twisted sculptures and heard the chatter of kingfishers and the splash of turtles sliding off logs. I stopped for lunch on a gravel bar, eating a sandwich and sipping iced tea from a thermos. I thought about how Mary and I had planned to kayak when we retired, but never got the chance. As the sun warmed my shoulders, I felt a sense of fulfillment that I was living the dream for both of us. As the years turned, Sarah remarried. This time, she chose a man named Mark, an elementary school teacher with a quiet demeanor and a love of hiking. They met at a volunteer event and bonded over a shared love of helping others. Mark respected boundaries and never asked about my finances. When I gave them a housewarming gift, he thanked me politely and moved on to discussing the garden he wanted to plant. Sarah and Mark adopted a rescue dog, a chocolate lab named Coco, and invited me over to meet her. I brought a bag of treats from Petco and spent the afternoon throwing a ball in their backyard. Watching Sarah laugh with her new partner restored my faith that she could find happiness without sacrificing her dignity. At my own home, I adopted a cat from the animal shelter. I named her Millie after my mother. Millie liked to curl up on my lap while I read the newspaper and to bat at the end of my pencil when I wrote in my journal. Her presence softened the edges of my solitary evenings. As Millie purred in my lap one evening, I opened the binder labeled "In Case of My Death" and reviewed its contents: copies of the trust, lists of accounts and passwords, instructions for the executor, and letters to loved ones. I updated the document to reflect new details, such as Sarah's divorce and remarriage. I felt reassured knowing that when my time comes, everything will be clear and organized. In my 70s, I continued to watch the news and read articles about elder rights. I followed court cases involving contested estates and guardianship abuse. I wrote letters to my state senator advocating for stricter penalties for financial exploitation of elders. I felt a responsibility to use my voice, however small, to effect change. Sometimes, when I drove past my old job sites, I would park and walk along the bridges I'd helped build. I ran my hand along the guardrail and listened to the hum of traffic. I thought about the thousands of people crossing safely each day, unaware of the hours and labor that went into the structure beneath them. I saw parallels with estate planning, quiet, unseen work that ensures others safe passage. At other times, I found myself in the aisles of Lowe's or Home Depot, picking up supplies for small projects. I built a new gate for my fence using cedar planks and galvanized hinges. I installed a rain chain to guide water from my gutter into a barrel. I hung solar lanterns that cast gentle light on summer evenings. These projects kept me engaged physically and mentally. They also reminded me of Mary, who loved to watch me work and to paint the finished pieces. I sometimes imagined her sitting on the porch, nodding in approval as I tightened the final screw. As time went on, I made more donations. I funded a program that provides therapy for veterans with PTSD through equine therapy. I contributed to a scholarship for girls in STEM. I donated to a local arts organization to support young musicians. Each gift carried Mary's spirit and my gratitude. I also took time to travel abroad. I visited Ireland, the land of my ancestors, and walked through green fields and along rocky cliffs. I toured the Ring of Kerry, visited ancient churches, and stayed in a bed and breakfast where the owner served me porridge and tea each morning. I lit a candle in a cathedral for Mary and wrote her name in the parish prayer book. In Italy, I wandered the streets of Florence, marveling at Renaissance art. I ate gelato near the Duomo and took a cooking class where I learned to make fresh gnocchi. I purchased a small painting from a local artist and mailed it home, excited to hang it in my living room as a reminder of the trip. Traveling internationally opened my eyes to how people in different countries treat elders. In Ireland, a young bus driver insisted I take the front seat. In Italy, a waitress brought me an extra chair for my bag without me asking. These gestures made me feel valued and contrasted sharply with the way Tyler had once dismissed me as a burden. Through all these experiences, I kept in touch with Sarah. We scheduled monthly dinners, alternating between her house and mine. We shared updates about our lives, our work, and our dreams. I could see how she grew in confidence and wisdom. One evening at my house, she asked, "Dad, do you ever regret spending the money instead of saving it for us?" I paused, took a sip of my tea, and answered honestly, "No. I used it to live, to honor your mother, to help others, and to set you free from someone who would have used it. What I left is a legacy of choices you can learn from." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, and said, "Thank you for showing me that love sometimes means letting go and trusting that the people you love will find their way." As we cleaned up the dishes that night, I felt a sense of closure and peace. The journey that began with an insult had led to growth, generosity, and deeper relationships. I continued to live fully. I planted a small orchard of peach and apricot trees in my backyard, tended by a drip irrigation system from a kit I bought at Ace Hardware. I hosted movie nights on the patio with a projector and a white sheet strung between two poles. I attended a woodworking fair in Fredericksburg and bought a handcrafted rocking chair made by a craftsman younger than my son-in-law. I also organized a fundraiser through my church to build a wheelchair ramp for a neighbor. We raised money by holding a bake sale, selling cookies and brownies baked in Pyrex dishes and packaged with ribbons. We built the ramp in a single day, using lumber from Lowe's and sweat equity. The neighbor cried tears of gratitude as she rolled down it for the first time. In 2024, I wrote an op-ed for the San Antonio Express-News about the importance of seniors spending their money wisely and refusing to be guilted into financing their relatives' risky ventures. The piece drew both praise and criticism, but it sparked dialogue. Readers wrote letters sharing their own stories, and a journalist asked to interview me for a follow-up article, though I politely declined to avoid media appearances that might distract from the message. Despite the critics, I stood by my message. Seniors have the right to enjoy their later years and to use their resources according to their values. My story eventually reached distant relatives. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years called to reconnect. One invited me to a family reunion in Oklahoma. I attended, bringing a photo album of Mary and our travels. Relatives asked about my decision to spend my inheritance, and I spoke frankly about boundaries, trust, and the power of intentional giving. Later that year, I received a certificate of appreciation from Texas A&M University for the scholarship endowed in Mary's name. I attended a luncheon where I met the first recipient, a young woman from a small town who wanted to become a trauma nurse. She thanked me for the opportunity, and I told her about Mary's dedication and the hope that she would carry forward the same compassion. The interaction filled me with joy. I realized that the money I spent on the scholarship had created a ripple effect that would continue long after I was gone. In my quiet moments, I still missed Mary, but I felt her presence in the choices I made and the lives I touched. I carried her letter in my wallet, its edges soft from being unfolded and read many times. I kept her memory alive by reading her notes and singing our favorite hymns softly to myself. Now, as I sit on my porch, watching the sun set over the Texas hills, I reflect on the journey that began with an insult and ended with empowerment. I think about Tyler and how his greed exposed cracks that needed to be addressed. I think about Sarah and her growth. I think about Mary and her wisdom. If you've listened this far, I hope you take away this message. You are not a burden because someone else says you are. Your worth is not measured by the money you leave behind, but by the life you live and the love you give. Spend your resources on experiences, people, and causes that align with your values, and do not let guilt or pressure dictate your choices. Before you go, share in the comments where you're listening from and whether you've ever faced pressure from family regarding inheritance. Your stories can help others feel seen and supported, and together we can build a community where seniors are valued and empowered to live fully. Thank you for journeying with me. May your road be lined with kindness, your boundaries be clear, and your days be filled with purpose and peace. As I close this chapter, I realize there are countless smaller stories that illuminate the journey from insult to empowerment, and I want to share them because they highlight resilience and the unexpected connections that can sustain us. In the months following my decision to spend down my inheritance, I began exploring the wider Texas landscape using my Airstream as a mobile base. I traveled to Fredericksburg in the Hill Country, where I sampled wines at vineyards and walked through fields of blooming bluebonnets. I stayed in a campground near Enchanted Rock, hiking the granite dome at sunrise and watching shadows dance across the valley. On another trip, I drove to Galveston Island, parking my trailer near the seawall and walking along the beach. I bought shrimp from a fisherman at the dock and cooked it in garlic and butter on my portable stove. I visited the historic Strand District and toured a restored Victorian mansion, imagining the families who once lived there and the storms they endured. These travels reinforced my appreciation for the beauty of Texas and the importance of preserving open spaces. They also introduced me to fellow travelers at campgrounds who shared their own stories of family conflict and independence. One couple told me they sold their house after their children insisted they downsize and now live full-time in their RV. They said they've never felt freer. When I wasn't on the road, I continued to volunteer. I joined a reading initiative at a local elementary school, similar to the program I participated in before. I sat with second graders, guiding their fingers under words as they sounded them out. Their excitement when they finished a page reminded me that small acts of patience can have long-term impact. I also expanded my involvement with the food bank. I started coordinating donation drives at my church and our neighborhood association. We held a canned goods drive in partnership with HEB, setting up collection bins near the store entrance. Customers dropped off cans of beans, corn, and soup, and we filled an entire truck bed with food for families in need. Through these efforts, I became more connected to my community. I learned the names of people who previously were just faces at church or neighbors I waved to in passing. We bonded over shared goals and realized that giving back binds us together in ways that money cannot. I also deepened my genealogical research. Inspired by the family stories I'd uncovered, I visited the Clayton Library Center for Genealogical Research in Houston. Browsing microfilm and census records, I discovered that my great-grandfather had filed a homestead claim in Texas in the 1890s and that my great-great-grandmother had been a midwife in a small town near Abilene. These discoveries broadened my sense of identity. They reminded me that I come from a line of resilient people who made bold moves for their families. It encouraged me to continue making decisions that honored their sacrifices and to leave behind a legacy of courage and generosity. Back at home, I continued to attend a support group for seniors dealing with family and financial stress. We met in a community center room with beige walls and folding chairs, and we shared stories about children pressuring parents to co-sign loans, siblings fighting over heirlooms, and in-laws making demands. Hearing these experiences validated my feelings and gave me strategies to cope. The facilitator, a licensed social worker, reminded us to establish boundaries, maintain written records, and seek professional advice. She also encouraged us to find joy in daily life and to cultivate hobbies that bring peace. Her advice led me to explore yoga at my local recreation center. The gentle stretches and deep breathing released tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. On a Saturday morning, I joined a birdwatching group at a nature center outside San Antonio. We walked along a trail lined with mesquite trees, binoculars in hand. Our guide pointed out painted buntings, cardinals, and a great horned owl perched on a branch. Each sighting was a thrill, a reminder that the world continues to teem with life and beauty no matter what happens in our personal circles. This connection to nature made me more attentive to the rhythms of the seasons. I planted a pollinator garden in my backyard with native plants like milkweed and salvia to attract butterflies and bees. I watched monarch butterflies lay eggs on the milkweed and observed caterpillars transform into chrysalises. The metamorphosis became a metaphor for my own transformation from someone trying to preserve wealth to someone who let it flow into new forms. Technology also became a tool for connection and protection. I learned to use a password manager and two-factor authentication to secure my online accounts. Sarah helped me set up text alerts for my bank accounts so I would know immediately if a large withdrawal or unusual transaction occurred. These measures gave me peace of mind and prevented small fraudulent charges from escalating. I subscribed to newsletters from AARP and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that warned about new scams, such as callers claiming to be from Social Security and threatening arrest if you didn't pay an alleged debt. I shared these alerts at church and with friends, reminding them never to share personal information over the phone. In addition to volunteering and personal growth, I became more active in local advocacy. I attended city council meetings to speak about property tax relief for seniors and wrote letters supporting measures that fund public libraries and parks. I realized that my voice as a retiree with decades of experience mattered and could influence local policy. I also connected with an organization that lobbies for stronger elder abuse laws. We met with state legislators to discuss closing loopholes that allow unscrupulous relatives to exploit seniors. One lawmaker shared that her own grandmother had been manipulated into changing her will by a caregiver. The personal nature of these stories helped move legislation forward. Meanwhile, I continued to invest in relationships with friends. Each Friday, a group of us gathered at a local diner, Jim's Restaurant, to drink coffee, eat biscuits with sausage gravy, and catch up. We called ourselves the Friday Crew, and we rotated who paid the bill. We laughed about aches and pains, debated the Spurs' chances in the playoffs, and swapped tips about the best car repair shops. One member of our group, Hank, shared his experience of being taken advantage of by his nephew who had convinced him to invest in a fake cryptocurrency. Hank lost $5,000 before he realized it was a scam. We collectively decided to attend a workshop at the public library on emerging financial scams, led by an FBI agent who explained how to verify investment opportunities and report suspicious activity. Listening to Hank and the agent reminded me again how important it is to stay informed. I downloaded a brochure about investment fraud and brought copies to my next Silver Sneakers class. We spent the cool-down stretching time discussing red flags and strategies for due diligence. Another day, at a free clinic where I occasionally volunteer with Sarah, a woman approached me in the waiting room. She said she recognized me from an article about my story and wanted to thank me. She shared that her daughter had called her a burden after she declined to finance a new car for her, and that she felt guilty until she read about my journey. She decided to spend money on remodeling her bathroom to make it wheelchair accessible and to take a trip to see her sister in Colorado Springs. Her gratitude made me realize that telling my story publicly, though initially uncomfortable, had broader impact. It also motivated me to continue writing and speaking about my experiences. using my voice to reach those who might be too ashamed or intimidated to speak up. During one therapy session, my counselor asked me to consider my relationship with money. She observed that I had been both a saver and a spender, and that each role had played a part in my identity. She encouraged me to think of money as a means to express values rather than as a measure of self-worth. This reframing helped me release residual guilt about not leaving everything to Sarah and about using resources to enjoy life. I decided to explore creative expression beyond woodworking. I signed up for a watercolor painting class at the senior center. We sat around tables with jars of water and tubes of paint, mixing colors on palettes and brushing them onto paper. My first attempts were amateurish, but I enjoyed watching the colors blend and learning to see light and shadow in new ways. Our instructor organized a small exhibition at the center, and I displayed a painting of the hill country at sunset. Sarah came to see it and jokingly offered to buy it. I laughed and said I'd give it to her for free because certain things like art and love shouldn't be commodified. Throughout these creative experiments, I found parallels between painting and financial planning. Both require layers, patience, and the courage to revise when something isn't working. Another hobby I rediscovered was playing the harmonica. I had learned it as a boy, but life had distracted me. I dug it out of a drawer, cleaned it, and began practicing. Eventually, I played folk tunes on my porch at night, the notes drifting out into the warm Texas air. Sometimes neighbors would clap, and sometimes they would sit quietly and listen. These small performances brought a sense of community and joy. Meanwhile, Sarah deepened her commitment to financial literacy. She started teaching workshops at her church, sharing what she learned from her course. She called me to practice her presentations, and I offered feedback and stories to illustrate her points. Seeing her empower others made me proud and assured me that the tough love I showed her had blossomed into strength. As part of my continued education, I attended seminars on estate planning hosted by a local bank. Representatives from Charles Schwab and Vanguard explained the difference between revocable and irrevocable trusts, the importance of updating beneficiary designations, and the impact of the Secure Act on inherited IRAs. I took notes and shared them with friends who were considering updates to their own plans. I also met with a tax professional to discuss the impact of charitable donations and to ensure I wasn't giving more to the IRS than necessary. She suggested I bunch charitable contributions in certain years to maximize itemized deductions and to explore qualified charitable distributions from my IRA. I implemented her advice and saved money while supporting causes I cared about. Over time, I continued to upgrade my home to make it more comfortable and efficient. I installed a tankless water heater that supplied endless hot water and lowered my utility bills. I replaced the old HVAC system with a high-efficiency unit from Carrier. I added additional insulation in the attic and sealed drafts around windows with weather stripping from Lowe's. These improvements not only saved money, but also increased the value of the house Sarah would eventually inherit. I also cultivated friendships with younger neighbors. A couple in their 30s moved into the house next door, and we bonded over our love of gardening. They helped me install a drip irrigation timer, and I shared with them my tips for pruning fruit trees. We exchanged produce, my peaches for their cucumbers, and sat on my porch drinking lemonade from mason jars while we chatted about community projects. One evening, I saw flashing lights across the street and walked over. An older neighbor had fallen and needed assistance. I called 911, grabbed my basic first aid kit, and sat with her while we waited for the paramedics. She thanked me repeatedly and later told me that she'd been afraid to ask for help because she didn't want to be a burden. I told her my story and reassured her that everyone needs help sometimes, and that asking isn't weakness. That conversation stuck with me. It reaffirmed my belief that the word burden should be used cautiously and never to shame someone into decisions. Being part of a community means sharing burdens so that no one person is overwhelmed. On Sundays, I continued attending church and volunteering with the hospitality committee. We brewed coffee in large stainless steel urns and arranged donuts on trays. I greeted people at the door, shaking hands and offering hugs. I loved hearing stories from other members, how one couple met at the church in the 1970s, how another family moved from Mexico and found a home here, and I felt grounded in tradition and purpose. Sometimes I would speak briefly during services about financial stewardship and the importance of planning. I shared the parable of the talents and emphasized that being a good steward includes protecting oneself from exploitation and using resources to serve others. As I engaged with my community, I kept exploring the world. I took a train trip on Amtrak Sunset Limited from San Antonio to Los Angeles, watching landscapes shift from mesquite scrub to desert to mountains. I conversed with fellow passengers in the dining car while eating French toast and bacon. A woman from Louisiana told me she was traveling to meet her grandchildren for the first time, and I shared my story of reconnecting with Sarah. In California, I visited Yosemite National Park and stood in awe of El Capitan and Half Dome. I hiked to Mirror Lake, watched climbers ascend granite faces, and thought about how small we are in comparison to nature's grandeur. The majesty of the park reminded me of Mary's love for natural beauty and reinforced my commitment to support conservation efforts. I also visited friends in Portland, Oregon, who took me to see Multnomah Falls. We hiked up the trail, the mist from the falls cooling our faces. At the top, we looked out over the Columbia River Gorge and talked about family, work, and the meaning of legacy. The conversation felt similar to many I'd had back home, proving that people everywhere wrestle with similar issues. Back in Texas, I resumed my routine of spending, volunteering, and educating. I added a new project, writing a memoir. I sat down each morning at my oak desk, opened my laptop, and typed for an hour. I organized chapters by themes: childhood, marriage, work, grief, insult, transformation, and legacy. Writing forced me to confront my emotions and to articulate the lessons I wanted to leave behind. I showed drafts to Sarah, who offered gentle feedback. I also shared them with my support group, and they encouraged me to publish the memoir through a self-publishing service. I researched options and selected one that allowed me to maintain control over the content and price. I plan to distribute copies at churches, libraries, and senior centers. In the memoir, I included practical tips: always have a will, review beneficiary designations annually, avoid co-signing loans, understand deposit hold policies, and never be rushed into financial decisions. I also included emotional guidance: set boundaries, seek counsel, trust your instincts, and remember that it's okay to spend your money on yourself. By the time I finished the memoir, the word count exceeded 100,000 words. I edited it down with the help of a retired English teacher from my Friday crew. We cut repetition, clarified passages, and ensured the narrative flowed. The process took months, but was deeply satisfying. When the book was finally printed, I held the first copy in my hands and smiled. It was tangible proof that I had transformed pain into purpose. I handed copies to Sarah, Mark, and my Friday crew. I donated copies to the library and to the legal aid office. I felt a sense of completion, but also understood that the work of living continues. As I approached my 75th birthday, I planned a celebration that mirrored the life I built. I invited friends, neighbors, church members, and my Friday crew. We gathered at a pavilion in a local park. There was live music by a country band from a nearby college, brisket and sausage from a barbecue joint, and games for kids. During the party, I stood up to speak. I thanked everyone for being part of my journey and shared a condensed version of my story. I said that being called a burden turned out to be a blessing because it forced me to reimagine what my legacy could be. I urged everyone to live intentionally, to protect themselves, and to use their resources to make the world a little better. After the speech, the band played On the Road Again, and people danced. Sarah hugged me tightly and whispered, "I'm so proud of you, Dad." Tears welled in my eyes, and for a moment I felt Mary's hand on my shoulder and her whisper in my ear, "Well done." As the evening drew to a close, the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of pink and orange. Lanterns cast a soft glow on the faces of friends and family. I sat at a picnic table, sipping sweet tea and soaking in the scene. I realized that the inheritance I had spent had yielded returns far greater than money. It had yielded self-respect, stronger relationships, new experiences, and a ripple effect of generosity. I had invested in myself and my community, and the dividends were measured in smiles, thank you notes, and shared memories. In the years that followed, I continued to live with intention. I donated monthly to the scholarship fund, visited national parks, cooked meals for friends, and attended city council meetings. I played harmonica on my porch and wrote letters to my future great-grandchildren, sharing stories about Mary, Sarah, and the importance of standing up for oneself. I also stayed vigilant. Scams evolved, laws changed, and new challenges arose. I kept learning, remained adaptable, and remained committed to protecting my autonomy and dignity. I taught others to do the same, paying forward the guidance I had received from Mary and from the professionals who had helped me. Eventually I grew slower. Tasks that once took an afternoon now took 2. I hired a handyman to help with yard work and a young neighbor to mow the lawn. I adjusted my routine, doing more reading and less traveling, but I didn't regret slowing down. I cherished the memories I had already created and the impact I had already made. My story, like every life, was finite. When my time came, I knew Sarah would find everything in order. A house well maintained, a trust that ensured her security while upholding values of education and service, letters explaining my choices, and a community of people ready to support her. If there's one final lesson to share, it's that your life is yours to design. Don't let others' greed or guilt dictate your choices. Your dignity is priceless, and your resources, time, money, energy, are tools to be used in alignment with your values. So plan wisely, live fully, love generously, and leave behind stories that inspire others to do the same. Even after wrapping up this narrative, I found myself recalling more vignettes that illustrate how my decision to spend my inheritance enriched my life and the lives of others. I'll share a few more to underscore that transformation is not a single event but an ongoing journey. One year, I decided to travel along the Gulf Coast to visit places I had only read about. I stopped in Lafayette, Louisiana, where I listened to Zydeco music at a local dance hall and ate gumbo seasoned perfectly with file powder. I took a swamp tour, gliding past cypress trees draped with Spanish moss while alligators floated lazily nearby. In Mobile, Alabama, I toured the USS Alabama Battleship Memorial Park. Walking through the steel corridors, I thought of my uncle who served in the Navy during World War II. I left a donation at the visitor center to support the preservation of the ship so future generations could learn from history. I continued east to Pensacola, Florida, where I visited the National Naval Aviation Museum. I marveled at the restored planes hanging from the ceiling and remembered building model airplanes with my father in our garage. I thought about how his lessons on patience and precision influenced my engineering career. While in Florida, I also stopped at a roadside stand selling boiled peanuts, a southern delicacy Mary loved. I bought a bag and sat under a magnolia tree, shelling the peanuts and savoring their salty flavor. Small pleasures like this reminded me that joy often resides in simple experiences. On my way back to Texas, I detoured through Mississippi to visit the home of writer William Faulkner. I toured his house, Roanoke, and walked through the gardens, reflecting on storytelling and the power of words to capture human complexity. I felt inspired to keep writing my memoir and to be honest about my flaws and growth. When I returned, I shared photos and stories with Sarah. She laughed at my description of trying to dance the two-step at a Zydeco dance hall and asked me to teach her when we had our next father-daughter night. Another trip took me north to Kansas City to visit an old college roommate. We toured the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum and the American Jazz Museum, learning about pioneers in music and sports. We ate Kansas City barbecue at Joe's Kansas City and debated whether it was better than Texas brisket. We agreed that each style had its merits, and the conversation highlighted how diversity enriches life. On that trip, I also stopped in Oklahoma to visit the Route 66 Museum. I walked through exhibits featuring vintage gas pumps and neon signs and thought about how travel has always symbolized freedom in our culture. I felt grateful that I was able to explore the country with my own resources. Back at home, my interest in cooking deepened. I began experimenting with recipes from cuisines I had tasted on my travels. I made jambalaya with andouille sausage, okra, and shrimp. I attempted gumbo, following a recipe that required making a dark roux, a process that demands patience and constant stirring. When I finally served the gumbo to Sarah and Mark, they declared it delicious, and I felt a sense of accomplishment. I also learned to bake bread. I started a sourdough starter using flour and water and tended to it like a pet. I named it Myrtle and fed it regularly. My first loaves were dense, but over time, I produced crusty, airy bread. I shared loaves with neighbors and friends, enjoying the way the smell of baking bread filled my home and the look of delight on recipients' faces. These culinary adventures taught me that learning new skills keeps the mind sharp and brings joy. They also reinforced my belief that spending money on classes or quality ingredients is a worthwhile investment in personal happiness. In addition to cooking, I took up photography. I purchased a mid-range digital camera from Best Buy and enrolled in a community college class to learn about aperture, shutter speed, and composition. I practiced by taking pictures of sunsets, birds, and interesting architecture around San Antonio. I printed my favorite shots at Walgreens and framed them using frames I built in my workshop. Photography changed the way I observed the world. I began noticing details like the way light filtered through leaves, the contrast between old and new buildings, and the expressions on people's faces at the farmer's market. It reminded me to slow down and appreciate the present moment. As my creative pursuits expanded, so did my network. I joined a photography club that met monthly to critique each other's work. Members ranged from teenagers to octogenarians, and we learned from each other. One young member showed me how to edit photos using free software, while I shared my experiences with film cameras and darkroom techniques from decades past. I also attended weekend workshops on blacksmithing and metal casting at a nearby ranch. The smell of coal, the sound of hammers striking anvils, and the glow of molten metal transported me back to my engineering days. I forged a simple hook and a decorative leaf, marveling at how the material responded to heat and force. The instructor, a woman in her 40s, told us that blacksmithing is both art and science, a blend of intuition and physics. These workshops were not cheap, but I viewed the cost as an investment in my mind and in supporting artisans who keep traditional crafts alive. I kept the leaf on my desk as a reminder that we can reshape our lives just as iron can be shaped in fire. One day at the grocery store, I noticed a flyer on the bulletin board advertising a local theater's production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. I bought a ticket, and on opening night I sat in the front row, watching community actors perform Shakespeare with enthusiasm and heart. The next day, I donated to the theater's fund to upgrade their lighting system, knowing that the arts enrich the community. During the winter holiday season, I organized a coat drive at my church. We collected gently used coats and new socks to distribute to shelters. Local businesses donated items. Target provided gift cards, and a small outdoor outfitter donated warm hats. The drive exceeded our expectations, and we delivered carloads of clothing to people in need. The gratitude on their faces reminded me that sharing resources is a tangible way to spread warmth in more ways than one. I also worked with Sarah and Mark to implement household energy upgrades at their home. We installed a programmable thermostat, sealed air leaks with caulk and weather stripping, and added solar path lights along their driveway. These improvements reduced their utility bills and gave me an opportunity to teach my grandchildren about the importance of conservation. Speaking of grandchildren, Sarah and Mark welcomed a baby girl named Grace in late 2025. Holding Grace for the first time, with her tiny fingers curled around mine, filled me with a love I hadn't felt since Sarah's birth. I promised myself to be a present grandparent and to share stories of Mary and the choices I had made. Grace's arrival reignited my letter-writing tradition. I wrote her a letter explaining why I spent my inheritance and how those decisions allowed me to spend time with her. I wrote about Mary, about values, and about the importance of self-respect. I sealed the letter in an envelope labeled "Open on your 18th birthday" and placed it in my safe deposit box. As Grace grew, I visited often. We read books, played with blocks, and went for walks in the park. I pushed her stroller along paths lined with live oaks and pointed out squirrels and butterflies. These simple outings cost little money but provided rich memories. I also opened a 529 college savings account for Grace and contributed regularly. I chose a plan through the state of Texas which offered tax benefits. I coordinated with Sarah to ensure she understood the contribution limits and how to manage the account. This act allowed me to support Grace's future education without handing over cash that might be misused. As my activities expanded, I made sure to keep my records organized. I created a spreadsheet to track charitable donations, travel expenses, and household improvements. I kept receipts in a file cabinet and scanned important documents to store on an external hard drive. This documentation simplified tax preparation and provided peace of mind. Speaking of taxes, I learned the value of working with a professional. I hired a certified public accountant to prepare my returns. She identified deductions I had missed, such as medical expenses and energy efficiency credits. She also helped me calculate the tax impact of my charitable distributions and ensured I complied with IRS regulations. In addition, I reviewed my homeowners and auto insurance policies. I shopped around for better rates and discovered that bundling my policies with USAA saved me money. I also increased my liability coverage to protect my assets in case of an accident. When my car's tires wore down, I researched options online and purchased a set of Michelin tires from Discount Tire. I made an appointment and waited in the lobby while the technicians installed them. I chatted with another customer, a retiree who had recently bought an RV and was debating the best routes for a cross-country trip. We exchanged contact information and later shared road trip tips via email. Another area I paid attention to was health. I scheduled regular dental cleanings and eye exams. I visited my dermatologist to monitor sunspots, a necessary precaution in the Texas sun. I took advantage of my Silver Sneakers benefit to join aquatic exercise classes, which provided low-impact workouts. I stocked my medicine cabinet with essentials like Tylenol, Voltaren gel for achy joints, and a blood pressure monitor. During an annual checkup, my doctor recommended I get vaccinated for shingles and pneumonia. I booked the appointments at CVS and waited the required interval between doses. This proactive approach to health ensured I could continue living an active life and enjoying the fruits of my decisions. I also focused on mental health. In addition to individual therapy, I attended a mindfulness meditation group at the local library. We sat in a circle, following guided meditations on breathing and awareness. I discovered that moments of stillness help me manage stress and appreciate the present. Meanwhile, my political engagement increased. I volunteered as a poll worker during local elections, greeting voters, checking IDs, and guiding them to the correct booths. I felt proud to facilitate democracy and to set an example for younger generations. I also wrote letters to my congressman about Social Security solvency and the importance of protecting benefits for future retirees. During an election cycle, I hosted a candidate forum at my church, inviting local candidates to answer questions from seniors. We asked about property tax relief, public safety, and transportation. The forum empowered older residents to engage in civic discourse and to hold leaders accountable. In my free time, I nurtured my love of music. I attended concerts at the Tobin Center for the Performing Arts, listening to symphonies and jazz ensembles. I purchased tickets well in advance and invited friends from my support group. The cost of the tickets was offset by the joy of live music and the conversations we had afterward. Sometimes I went to outdoor concerts and parks where musicians played under pavilions and food trucks sold tacos and snow cones. I brought a folding chair, hat to shield my face from the sun, and a cooler with water and snacks. These casual events fostered community and made me feel connected to people across generations. These experiences made me realize that spending money on tickets or gear is not wasteful when it supports local arts and enriches life. They underscored the idea that frugality should not mean deprivation, especially when there is enough to go around. Another meaningful project was mentoring. I joined SCORE, a nonprofit that pairs retired executives with small business owners. I mentored a young woman starting a landscaping company. We met at a coffee shop to discuss her business plan, marketing strategies, and pricing. I drew from my engineering and project management background to help her schedule jobs and manage cash flow. Watching her business grow and seeing her secure contracts with local businesses brought satisfaction that no bank balance could provide. She later told me that my guidance helped her avoid predatory loans and to negotiate fair terms with her vendors. In return, she taught me about new technologies in landscaping, like smart irrigation controllers and drought-resistant plant species. This exchange reminded me that mentorship is a two-way street and that both parties benefit. As for household maintenance, I tackled some do-it-yourself projects and hired professionals for others. I replaced old smoke detectors with ones that have built-in 10-year batteries. I serviced my HVAC system biannually to prevent breakdowns. I hired a plumber to install a new water softener, preventing mineral buildup in my pipes and appliances. I also added an extra layer of security to my home. I installed motion-activated lights from Ring on the exterior and a Simply Safe security system with window sensors and a keypad. The system sends alerts to my phone when doors open or when there's motion in the yard. This investment gave me peace of mind, especially when I traveled. During one winter storm, the power went out. I used the portable generator I had purchased from Home Depot to keep my refrigerator running and to charge my phone. I also checked on my elderly neighbors, making sure they had heat and supplies. We huddled around my fireplace, drinking hot cocoa and swapping stories until the power returned. These moments reinforced the importance of preparedness and community. They showed that spending on things like generators and security systems is not wasteful, but wise, especially in a region prone to weather extremes. In terms of transportation, I maintained my F-150 carefully. I followed the maintenance schedule, rotating tires, changing oil, and replacing brake pads at a local shop. I also installed a bed liner to protect the truck bed and purchased a set of WeatherTech floor mats to keep the interior clean. These upgrades extended the life of the vehicle and preserved its value. Sometimes I considered buying a new truck or even a hybrid vehicle to reduce fuel costs, but I weighed the expense against my needs and decided to wait. I researched models like the Ford Maverick Hybrid and the Toyota Tundra, keeping notes for the future. This deliberation reminded me that spending doesn't mean abandoning prudence. As my social circle expanded, I attended more celebrations. Weddings, graduations, anniversaries. Each event required a gift, so I created a budget for gifts and sought items that were meaningful but not extravagant. I often crafted cutting boards or picture frames, combining my woodworking skills with a personal touch. Recipients appreciated the effort and uniqueness. At holiday gatherings, I continued my tradition of baking cinnamon rolls. I also experimented with new recipes like pecan pie bars using pecans from a farm stand. I brought dishes in my Pyrex pans and left the pan as part of the gift. These contributions allowed me to share my skills and resources while expressing love. Another facet of my spending plan involved paying forward kindness in small ways. When eating at a diner, I occasionally paid for a stranger's meal anonymously. When I saw a college student struggling to pay for groceries at H-E-B, I quietly handed cash to the cashier. When a single mother in my support group needed new tires, I used my discount at Discount Tire to purchase them for her. These acts were not about recognition, but about spreading the generosity I had received. I kept a kindness fund envelope in my kitchen drawer, filled with a few $100s in cash. I used it spontaneously when opportunities arose. At the end of each year, I replenished the envelope from my savings, ensuring that generosity remained a budget line item just like utilities or groceries. In the realm of activism, I participated in a rally advocating for affordable insulin. I marched with diabetics and their families downtown, holding a sign that read, "Insulin should not cost lives." My friend Hank, who has diabetes, appreciated my support. We later wrote letters to pharmaceutical companies urging them to lower prices. This activism reminded me that spending time and energy is just as valuable as spending money. I also attended public forums on property tax reform. I shared how rising taxes can pressure seniors on fixed incomes to sell their homes, contributing to displacement. I supported proposals for tax freezes for long-term homeowners and for increased state funding to compensate school districts. My testimony added a personal touch to abstract policy discussions. As my life continued, I faced new challenges. My knees began to ache more, and my doctor recommended physical therapy. I attended sessions twice a week, performing exercises to strengthen the muscles around my joints. The therapy office had a poster that said, "Motion is lotion," and I took that to heart, continuing to walk daily and to stretch. I also experienced loss. Friends from my Friday crew passed away. We held memorial services, sharing stories over coffee and tears. These losses reminded me of the impermanence of life and the urgency of living fully. They also reinforced the value of the connections we had built. We comforted each other and celebrated the lives of those who had influenced us. I made plans for my own memorial. I chose a simple graveside service with a playlist of Mary's favorite hymns and requested that a friend play live harmonica music. I wrote down my wishes and discussed them with Sarah, Mark, and my pastor. I prepaid for the service and selected a marker that matched Mary's, ensuring our resting places would reflect our shared life. In my final years, I continued to mentor, to learn, and to give. I never regretted spending my inheritance on experiences, community, and causes. I saw my decisions ripple out, inspiring others to evaluate their relationships with money and family. I heard from strangers who said my story gave them courage to say no to manipulative relatives and yes to adventures they'd postponed. On my last birthday, I sat in my rocking chair on the porch, Millie curled up beside me, and watched Grace and her friends play tag on the lawn. Sarah and Mark grilled burgers nearby, and friends from church mingled under the shade of live oaks. The sounds of laughter and conversation flowed like a hymn. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of charcoal and blooming jasmine. I felt content, knowing that my decisions, sparked by the sting of being called a burden, had led to a life rich in relationships, experiences, and purpose.